is whether freedom of expression is under threat in the digital age. Even as we speak, the two young girls who were initially arrested for some innocuous postings on the social media and then released because there was an outrage. The charges have still not been withdrawn against them. We have television journalist Naveen Surinje, who is in jail for now over 2 months in Bangalore because he reported on a certain group attacking a homestay in Bangalore, and instead of being rewarded for his work, he has been charged under the criminal code for being one of the perpetrators, and bail has been denied to him. There are several issues. We know about the cartoonist, we know about the two professors in Jadavpur University. We know that the number of restrictions or things removed from social media in India are among the highest in the world. So there are lots of issues which face us, and most importantly, the government's continued defense of Section 66A of the Information Technology Act of 2000. We have an excellent panel of 5 people. We will begin with Sunil Abraham from Bangalore, who runs the Center for Internet Society.
To begin with, internet freedom. This is a term that is mostly popularized by Hillary Clinton and her team at the US State Department. If you ask corporations like Google, and Raman is here to talk more about Google's perspective, what internet freedom means, they will say it means hands off the internet. That's what they think it means. What they usually really mean by that is hands off Google. They don't want governments interfering with large corporations like Google. But what is particularly strange about this civil liberties promotion from the US State Department is 3 very specific things. Number 1, it is a technology-specific civil liberties agenda. You never hear the US State Department extend the argument to television freedom. You never see Hillary Clinton talking about how television should be uniformly free across the world. If you turn on your television set in any US hotel, you will notice, just in terms of choice, you don't have the 600 channels you will get in an Indian hotel. You don't have multiple religions represented in terms of evangelical preaching. You don't have linguistic choice. You don't have programming choice, etc. So America is very keen, because it suits them at this particular historical moment, to evangelize internet freedom, and then they find common cause with large American intermediaries. So we must think through that question a little carefully. The second element to the American internet freedom rhetoric is it does not include access to knowledge. If you read Article 19 very closely, then you realize in order to express oneself, in order to have free speech, then you also need one precondition, and that is the precondition of access to knowledge. And most recently, if you are on Twitter, you would notice that one very important internet hero has committed suicide, Aaron Swartz. And this was for retrieving more than 5 million scholarly articles from JSTOR, which is a scholarly database. All these 5 million articles had already expired in terms of copyright, and all Aaron Swartz was hoping to do was place articles that are already in the public domain, but behind proprietary walls onto torrent networks like the Pirate Bay. JSTOR, which has Lawrence Lessig on its board, withdrew charges, but the American prosecutors decided to continue and heaped all sorts of charges against Aaron Swartz. Some of these charges would have got Aaron Swartz 30 years in jail. and Aaron Swartz committed suicide. And again, you can see Hillary Clinton did not speak out in favor of Aaron Swartz like she did when the Chinese blogosphere was censored, perhaps. So the American definition of internet freedom does not extend to access to knowledge, very critical in our country, both from a knowledge perspective and also from the perspective of access to essential medicines. The internet freedom concept also, according to Hillary Clinton, does not include privacy. America, like most other countries, is rolling out comprehensive surveillance technology. In America, the safeguards that are available to European citizens, thanks to the Data Protection Directive, are unavailable. There are some amount of vertical privacy protections, but not as comprehensive as Europe. And Hillary Clinton does not see, in her mind, any contradiction. On the one hand, rolling out comprehensive surveillance, and on the other hand, championing internet freedom. If you try and censor certain content, then, like Barbara Streisand discovered, that content becomes more popular. People go out of the way to share that content, to publish that content, and access the content. So precisely the message that you're trying to shut down gets even more amplified. And in India also, when the government has on various occasions executed block orders inappropriately, they've had precisely that effect. The content that has been blocked has raged across the nation. Over the last 10 years, we had a war against consumers, executed mostly by rights holders, the Motion Picture Association of America and the Recording Industry Association of America. Notices were sent to thousands of American youngsters. Some of them were taken to court, still others were arrested. And this action of censorship, if one's definition of internet freedom includes access to knowledge, resulted in young Americans adopting virtual private networks and encryption wholesale. What activists were unable to do for decades was done by the rights holders in America through their acts of censorship within no time. And we saw this also in Bangalore for the first time when the government of India had a legitimate reason to regulate speech during the exodus of northeastern Indians from Bangalore and other cities, when a limit was placed on the daily SMSs that users could send. Users migrated to platforms like WhatsApp and other messaging services that are harder to monitor, harder to censor, harder to control. So there is this unintended effect of censorship, and that is why when the government decides to regulate speech, it must do it as last resort, because usually regulation of speech has the opposite effect. It amplifies the speech that you're trying to keep in check, and it teaches ordinary citizens all sorts of tricks to avoid monitoring and regulation of speech. Thank you so much.
Freedom of expression is always under threat, in every time, in every age, digital or otherwise. Is it particularly under threat in the digital age? My answer is no. On the contrary, while all technologies have the potential for good and evil, if you have a very sharp knife, you can use it to cut your meatloaf or to cut someone's throat. Where I think the digital age is actually in itself a real threat is not so much to free speech, it is to privacy. To privacy. If I don't have the confidence that what I'm sharing with a couple of friends is going to stay with those couple of friends, but may suddenly be shared with the whole world, I will not speak as freely. To that extent it is. But on the whole, my answer is the digital age is a huge plus for freedom of expression. And by the way, if I may say so to our friend from Google, Google is terrifically good on free speech. It's not half so good on privacy, because it's by knowing all about you that it makes its money through targeted advertising. The digital age changes the way we have to think about free speech in the following fashion. In the whole of the modern period, the basic rule of thumb was, when in Rome, do as the Romans do, right? So if you're in the US, you follow the First Amendment. If you're in England, you follow the common law. If you're in India, you follow Indian law, and so on. Now, the possibilities of the digital age, regardless of frontiers, the fact that the rule, when in Rome, do as a Roman do, no longer applies, because when you're in Rome, you're simultaneously in Singapore and New York and Beijing, and also the people of Rome come from everywhere else. So it's a combination of the internet and mass migration. What actually determines your effective freedom of expression is not just the state you're in and its laws. It's at least three other things. It's a bunch of international organizations and networks, some of which you've never heard of, like ICANN, which organizes the structure of the internet, or the International Telecommunications Union, the ITU, which is making a power grab to try and control the internet. It's the state you're in. Then thirdly, it's what I call the private powers. If Facebook were a country, it would be the third largest country in the world, after India and China. 1 billion users. What Facebook does is much more important than what France does. What Google does is much more important than what Germany does, in terms of your effective freedom of expression. Electronically and digitally empowered communities. The Arab Spring, notably in Egypt and Tunisia, was actually made possible. And this is the first people power revolution where this is true, by the electronic media and social media. It did actually organize online. India is a huge swing state in this battle. Somewhere between India and the US at that end, Europe and the US at that end, and China at this end. A country which, if I may say so, has the most fantastic practice of free speech, almost free for all in some respects. Ladies and gentlemen, free speech has never meant unlimited speech, global logorrhea. That it does not mean. There is no liberty without law, right? So the question is not, should we have unlimited speech? It is, what are the legitimate limits? We need a genuinely global debate on these issues that goes across frontiers and is not confined just to one country and to one language. So please come and join us on the website. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, and it's great to be here. I want to start where both Tim and Ajit got to at some points in their presentations as well, and that is to touch on this question of borders. Because if we start, well, one step before that and remind ourselves that freedom of expression is a universal right, it's not a US and European right, and it's not a Indian right, it's a universal right, and it's a fundamental right. And if we think about what that says in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, I'm not going to quote you it exactly, but it's about the freedom to send, receive, impart, exchange information and ideas by any media and regardless of frontiers. So I think that has always been there as an issue and a challenge, and of course that means that Tim is right, that in many ways the digital age should be this great boon and boost for freedom of expression. And so freedom of expression has never been a universal right within one country, that I should sit there back home in the UK and have freedom of speech there, and you should sit here in India and have freedom of speech here, but we shouldn't have it between us, whether by books or phone or now the digital age. So I think universality of that universal right is always been really important, but certainly it's got much more challenged as a result of the swiftness and the reach of the digital age. I think there are three risks, really. We risk moving towards a much more controlled net. I think we risk moving towards a partially censored net. And I think as part of that, we then risk moving to a fragmented net. And the World Wide Web works and gives us what it gives us by being international, by not being fragmented. So I think in many ways these borders, whether geographical or virtual, are very, very important. What I want to talk about very briefly is, first of all, to make some remarks about state censorship online in the world today. I want to talk a little bit about corporate censorship and the privatization of censorship, and I will touch very briefly, if I have time, on issues around surveillance and mass surveillance of people online today. I think if we talk about state censorship, I think the very phrase conjures up the authoritarian countries, doesn't it? It makes us think about China or Iran, who's trying to build its own internet just within Iran, completely sealed off from the rest of the world. Or it may conjure up Russia with its new laws that are allowing it to blacklist and block a whole new set of websites. Let's not think offline and online are somehow two separate worlds. The politics and the laws cut across them. But I think what should really be our focus tonight is censorship in democracies. And of course, censorship in democracies is actually in many ways very easy. Because if you go back to that Universal Declaration of Human Rights that I mentioned at the start, it's a fundamental right, our free speech, but it's not an absolute right. And what that means, if you're an international lawyer, which I'm not, or if you're a politician, is that there are reasons or excuses, such as national security, public order, public morals, however you define those, and other issues, which might mean you can, to a necessary and proportionate extent, constrain free speech. I think what we've seen in the last year or two in the UK, and I don't have time to go into great detail, but we've seen a really worrying trend in terms of criminalisation of speech, especially on social media. And if I just give you a couple of examples, there was a young student was arrested in November. What was his crime? He'd put a photo onto Facebook of burning one of the red poppies that some people in the UK, a lot of people, but not me, choose to wear in November as a war memory of the war dead in the UK. Well, yes, sensitive topic, but certainly in the UK that I think I grew up in, there were always debates about wars. There were always people in favour or against, whether it was the Iraq War or the Falklands War or even the Second World War. But he was arrested, and it's interesting to hear people here talk about Section 66A, if I've got that right, in the UK. It's the Comms Act 2003, Article 123, and that bans grossly offensive language, and it criminalises grossly offensive language. But it was actually developed not in 2003, but it came back from the 1930s. And what's happening in the UK is a law that was developed to stop harassment of public telephone operators is now being used to drag teenagers from their beds and arrest them because they've put photos of a burning poppy onto Facebook. Or I can give you slightly more, what would be more offensive examples for some. One man was given a community service punishment order because he put a Facebook post up that said British soldiers in Afghanistan should burn in hell. Well, it's a bit graphic. It's certainly both against the war in Afghanistan and it's against British soldiers, but can we not tolerate that sort of free speech in Britain anymore? Or are we getting more sensitive because of things being online? Or are we more sensitive, we somehow start to feel we should never be offended? So I think these are all issues that challenge all of us. I think there's two sides to the privatisation of censorship that worry me when we look at the digital age today. One is that governments are starting to co-opt those private companies, and to some extent the private companies are standing up to that, and that's very welcome. They're saying, you should do the monitoring, you should do the filtering, you should do the takedown, and it comes back to what was just being said about intermediary liability and trying to get people to understand why that's such a critical issue. So I think there's one set of issues there around privatisation of censorship. But there's the other side, which has also been mentioned already, and that's the fact that Facebook has its 1 billion members. And for its 1 billion members, it's saying what speech and what photos and what visual speech or visual expression is acceptable and is not acceptable. And that's the role that governments used to play. But I think, as a number of other speakers have said, the issue of surveillance, privacy, and the potential chilling effects of that are another another really important element if we're trying to identify what are the things we should be most worried about. I don't have time to go into it, but as Tim said, that's not to say the web should be an anarchy, that's not to say we don't live in societies that have a rule of law, but that is to say we have to look very carefully at what's going on the internet, where our principles and laws go across, where the technology may create a new issue, like this question of what's an intermediary, are there a publisher, are there a service provider, whose roles are what. But let's not go for knee-jerk reactions just because something that may have been offensive if it was in a newspaper is offensive but more widely disseminated on Twitter or Facebook or somewhere else, or we'll soon find if we try and stop with a global top-down agreement that we're all going to have no offensive speech around the world, which of course Russia and China would sign up to, and that's what they were playing at the ITU, we'll find we've shrunk our space for free speech to pretty much nothing at all. Thank you.
And the first thing I wanted to talk about was to just give you a sense of what I want to talk about right now. And that's about three things. One is, as many people on the panel pointed out, it's not about absolute freedom. It's not about no regulation, but obviously it is about what's appropriate and lawful. As a person involved in technology policy, but more importantly as a lawyer, brought up in the tradition of India's commitment to democracy and constitutionalism, we all recognize that you have restrictions and they can be imposed. The point, of course, and that's why lawyers make their money, unfortunately, is you find out is whether those restrictions are lawful or constitutional. The other point, of course, that technologists sometimes point out in this regard is whether regulations sometimes are appropriate, and that's something of a policy question. It's also a technical question. For example, you might want to do something, but literally sometimes, for example, architecture will not allow you to build a 20-story building on marshland, for example. That's a great example. Engineers sometimes point out when politicians or regulators can't give them great solutions saying do this, they say, well, we can't because it's just not technologically not possible to do. Or you could do it, but you make a decision that you want to curb the ability of a product to work rather than reach its true potential. There are two other things that I also wanted to mention, and again, the panel mentioned this previously, that the debate is global. It's not just about one country, it's not just painting villains versus heroes, it's about the fact that in many countries across the world, particularly democracies, and I do admit a bias there, I personally am more interested in what democracies do on this, because that is where the debate takes place. And also being a person who's been brought up in one, I've been interested in what takes place here, also with our fellow countries in other regions, as to what's taking place. These debates are global, and that's something the panel pointed out, and I'm going to give you a bit more of context there. Lastly, and this is what I want to start with, is my personal sense of optimism about this, and to realize what we're really looking at. And let me give you an anecdote about this first. Some of you might be familiar, around a couple of years ago, there were bomb attacks that took place in Bombay, and people were trying to respond to it. During that time, it was quite difficult for residents in Bombay. I had friends as well there. And they were trying to find out where can they go, what forms of commuter transit were available, where could they go, for example, if they wanted to donate blood. They were friends of theirs they couldn't find, they were trying to locate them. And the interesting thing is that in many cases around the world when this takes place, you have emergency responder services who try to do things. Now, as you know, of course, that we in our country, we're trying to put in place many of these mechanisms. But what's interesting is the story of what I call as the Google document behind this. So I just noticed this online on Twitter, of all things, that somebody set up a link saying, oh, if you're trying to find your friends in Bombay, perhaps we should just put all of the names in one Google document, a document that you can put up online and that anyone can edit, and put across your missing friends' names there, let's try to find them. Somebody did that, and they said, okay, my friends are stranded, how can they go from X location to Y location in Bombay? People started adding on their own, as they saw this trend on Twitter, they started adding locations of taxi services that were still running, commuter train services that were still available, and other transit information. And as I saw it in 2 hours, it went from just a document about missing friends to transit information, information about blood banks, information about true information from the police helpline numbers, and other things like that. And this is all possible. And just imagine it, this wasn't the case not just, I'm talking about 10 or 20 years ago, but even 5 years ago. You couldn't have a situation where somebody could just start with one simple document, put it up online, anyone could access it, anyone could collaborate with it, and instantaneously publish information and could work. For example, frankly, as a person who works for Google, I was more worried that our systems wouldn't be able to take it and it would crash. Luckily, it didn't. The Communications Decency Act, which said that in the US, the federal government would be given extraordinary powers to go ahead and put restrictions regarding decency. And then there are 2 stories about this that I want to give you. The first is the fact that the US Supreme Court, even back in 96, 98, and a Supreme Court with judges who tend to be conservative, who tend to have, and at that point of time never probably used the web, they went ahead and declared this to be unconstitutional. And the reason they gave for it was very interesting. They said that the internet deserves free speech protection. And that's something that many of us might be sympathetic to right now. But they gave something even more interesting. They said the internet deserves free speech protection, like any medium of communication, but it deserves incredibly powerful free speech protection because it is unparalleled in its ability to work, in the sense and how it makes expression possible and how it allows people to collaborate and to network across borders at practically zero cost. They said any regulation that applies to the net therefore must be appropriate for its engineering. So they said not that there should be no regulation. The regulation should be appropriate for what takes place there. So for example, pre-licensing content, saying that you have to have your content rated before you could put it up on the web would be a bit problematic, at least in the context of the US. How should governments across the world look at matters concerning internet speech? And what Frank LaRue eventually came out with was a report that said governments have a lawful need to sometimes put in place regulation, but the regulation should be very carefully done and only under certain conditions permitted by instruments such as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Instruments which, by the way, for example, India truly cherishes, and our Supreme Court has strengthened and repeatedly cited. What's more interesting is that this was in fact passed by the UN Human Rights Council, a wide, diverse body of governments from across the world, not just Western governments, not just Southern governments, but countries across the world, where the UN Human Rights Council endorsed his recommendations and said the internet deserves protection in many ways. This is an important value which we must further. For example, I was proud to say that as an Indian that India voted in favor of that resolution as well. But what I wanted to go to then was the fact that these debates have been happening in many places. And it's been happening because the internet is even more important to our daily lives. For example, recently, in the European Court of Human Rights in the European Union, it was found that when Turkey, for example, blocked entire sites, not just specific content, but when they blocked entire sites because they wanted to take punitive action, that violated the European Declaration of Human Rights and violated international human rights standards. And what's interesting, again, going back to the economic point that I pointed out, is that that the judges of the European Court of Human Rights pointed out, not just was it a threat and a violation of the European Declaration of Human Rights, but it's also the fact that it had an enormous negative economic impact as well. It affected livelihoods. So it's not just about the right to free speech and expression, but it's about the fact of the right to livelihood to people who are now making use of the internet as the fundamental way of communication and the fundamental way of doing business. For example, most newspapers now in India have a website. I remember when people were logging in, even at that point of time, I admit to being fairly young at that age, but people logging in via textual interfaces called shell accounts and seeing very crude information coming out there. Whereas today, for example, somebody can take a picture on a mobile phone and instantaneously publish it saying this is taking place. And what's interesting is that the European Court of Human Rights then went to say that, look, people may abuse this power, then you specifically block content in certain cases under acceptable process, but you don't block entire means of communication.